Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Sunday night video. This week I am covering a few of the very early cases of the people who were hanged, or even in some cases beheaded, at Newcastle for various different offences. I wanted to cover a few of these stories in more detail, but sadly most of them are from so far back that very little information about them is available. So I have decided to put them together in their brief form in one single video. And a lot of them really do have very little information to go with them. But I do hope that you will find it as interesting as I did when I was first researching them for this video. But before we begin, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. One of the earliest executions that I can find dates back to 1306, and it is the hanging of John de Seton. The story goes that Robert the Bruce had killed his enemy John Comyn at Dumfries. The English king, Edward I, heard about this, and he then marched to the borders, and when he reached Lanercost he made a proclamation. He said that all who were guilty of the death of John Comyn would be sent to their death by hanging, and that this would also include anyone who had encouraged those who had committed the deed. And it would seem that John de Seton, who had done nothing much more than witness the death, was one of those who was hanged at Newcastle, and this hanging may have also included being drawn and quartered. To be hung, drawn and quartered meant that the prisoner would be drawn behind a horse to the place of execution. They would then be hung until they were almost dead, and then they would basically be cut into quarters. Now I have to admit that some of the ways that people were executed in the past were absolutely awful. Someone being hung, drawn and quartered was, in simple terms, a cruel and incredibly painful death, but for the era it was seen as just being normal. And it seems this was poor John's fate, and all because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next date on the list is 1461, and this was the execution of James Butler. James was the 5th Earl of Ormond, Earl of Wiltshire, and was also a Lancastrian. He took part in the Battle of Taunton, a place in Yorkshire, during the Wars of the Roses. And when the Lancastrians were defeated by the Yorkists, James, along with many others, was sentenced to death. And on May the 1st, 1461, he was beheaded at Newcastle. Now I have to admit that this made me wonder where this may have taken place. I wasn't even aware that anyone had been beheaded in Newcastle until I began looking into this story. And sadly, a little online search has not really thrown up any locations. So if anyone listening to this has any ideas where this may have taken place, do please let me know in the comments below. And I did think that it may have been somewhere near to Newcastle Castle. The next execution took place in 1464, and this appears to have been a mass execution. The Battle of Hexham had taken place on May the 15th of 1464, and this resulted in several people being captured, and some of those named were Henry, Duke of Somerset, Lord Ross, Lord Mullins, Lord Hungerford, Sir Thomas Wentworth, Sir Thomas Hughes, and Sir John Findern. And, of course, these men were all sentenced to death for treason. The Duke of Somerset was beheaded at Hexham and is buried in Hexham Abbey. The other men were all beheaded at Newcastle, again leaving me with the same question as to where exactly this would have happened. And one man, who seems to go by the name of either William Taleboys or Tallboys, who also called himself the Earl of Kent, had escaped with Henry VI. However, he was soon captured, and he too was returned to Newcastle and beheaded. Henry VI, however, was not found until July of 1464, and he was then held captive in the Tower of London for several years. In January of 1528, Roger Armstrong was one of a group of thieves who came in to the northeast area, and among other things he apparently made off with the Bishop of Muggleswick in Durham. And it seems that 18 of the men who had been involved in this crime gave themselves up to the Earl of Northumberland, and 17 of them were sentenced to death. These 17 were for the main part beheaded, but some who were classed as leaders of the group were hung, drawn and quartered, and their heads were displayed at Newcastle Castle to hopefully put others off from committing the same kind of crimes. Robert Armstrong, however, was hung in chains near Newcastle, although the exact location is not given, and I'm not entirely sure on this part as to whether he was actually hung in chains alive, which I do believe sometimes happened, or whether he had been executed first. On April the 1st of the same year, 6 further well-known thieves were also executed at Newcastle, although no names are given on this occasion, so perhaps the paper thought that they were so well known people would have just guessed who they were. In 1564, an unnamed man was hanged at Newcastle for forging money. He was said to have committed this crime at the great inns of Pilgrim Street. Priests made by Roman authority were forbidden under pain of death to come into England between the years of 1577 and 1603. Now 1603 was also the year that Queen Elizabeth I died. 124 priests and 57 laymen and women who had been harbouring the priests suffered this fate of death. In January of 1593, I don't know why I constantly try to say 19. In January of 1593, Edward Watson was executed at Newcastle for this same crime, which is obviously the Roman priests. And on 4 consecutive days during July, 4 more men were executed for the same reasons. 1 at Durham, 1 at Gateshead, 1 at Darlington, and 1, Joseph Lambton, at Newcastle. And the article about Joseph stated that he was executed in the flower of his youth and in front of his friends. In 1599, a man by the name of Clement Rutherford was executed at Newcastle Castle. However, his crime is unknown. What is known is that he was later buried at St. John's Church on Granger Street in Newcastle. Now, this was apparently the burial place of several other people who had been executed at Newcastle. Sadly, although it would have been doubtful that any of these executed victims would have had headstones, there is no sign of the graves today, and in fact, hardly any headstones are visible in the churchyard. On August the 13th, 1639, several prisoners by the names of John Anderson, James and Oswald Brown, George Ranson, Thomas Debdell and Amos Hull were executed at Newcastle. Sadly, there was no indication of what their crimes might have been. However, an interesting side note was added to the article, which stated that the register of St. Andrew's Parish contained the following entry. An old man and woman were married on the 30th day of August 1639. They had 2 boys that danced off a rope in the castle yard. And the article wondered if these 2 boys may have been James and Oswald Brown. Now, I have to admit that I found the entry in the parish records rather odd. What a strange thing to say that the couple's sons danced off a rope. It was clear what they meant, but you have to wonder why they added this detail and in such a strange manner. In 1640, Anthony Vickers, who was one of 2 soggers, a sogger, it appears, was another name for a soldier, was stood against a wall in the big market and shot for refusing to take the king's pay. Now, as said, he was one of 2 soldiers, and both had been found guilty of the crime, but only one was executed. And the reason for this was that the men were asked to draw lots to see who would live and who would not, and clearly Anthony lost. What a most bizarre way to decide the fate of these 2 men. The other man was not named, so there is no way of knowing what happened to him after this. In 1650, 26 men and women said to be a mix of witches and thieves were executed on the town moor, and this included Eleanor Robson, who had simply been found guilty of stealing some silver spoons. So it really didn't take much for people to be hanged in the past. As for the witches of this story, if you are interested in hearing more, then please keep an eye out for an upcoming video, hopefully next week, when I will cover this part of the story in more detail. In 1701, John Fenwick, J.P. of Rock in Northumberland, was hanged for the murder of Ferdinando Foster. It was said that John was hanged somewhere between the White Cross and a thorn bush in Newgate Street on September the 25th. Now, this location was apparently close to the scene of the crime, and although it probably means nothing to us today, no doubt back in 1701, anyone wishing to see the site of the hanging would have easily found it from this very odd description, but I doubt very much that the thorn bush is anywhere in sight today. In 1733, 2 unnamed men were hanged on the town moor. Sadly, their names and crimes was something the article clearly thought no one wanted to know. In 1739, Michael Curry was hanged for the murder of Robert Sheville and John Wilson for the murder of Barbara Trumbull. Both men were hanged at the Westgate in Newcastle. Michael Curry was later gibbeted at Whitley Bay, and it was somewhere close to the scene of the crime. And some of you may be aware of the plaque near the lighthouse at Curry's Point, which was said to be the location of the gibbet. Sadly, that story is one that I have yet to find enough information about to really do a full story about the murder, but who knows, maybe one day. In 1743, a man by the name of William Brown, sometimes referred to as Sir William Brown, was hanged at the Westgate in Newcastle. He was in charge of a band of thieves, and he had been transported for his earlier crimes. He had, however, somehow managed to return to the area and was arrested again, and although he pleaded to be transported, the courts refused to spare his life. Transportation was a criminal punishment that involved sending convicts to distant lands such as America and later Australia as an alternative to execution, and in many cases those transported would serve out their sentence and be released, but never be able to afford to return to the UK. In 1744, Thomas Lister was found guilty of horse stealing, and James Mabon and John Samuel were found guilty of forging money, and all were hanged at the Westgate on August the 11th. Now, I believe that these 3 men were also buried at St John's Church in Granger Street. In 1746, Alexander Anthony, who was 26 years old, was shot on the town moor on September the 15th for desertion. In 1751, Richard Brown, who was a keelman, was hanged on the town moor on August the 21st for the murder of his 17-year-old daughter. In 1752, Ewan MacDonald, a soldier, was hanged on September the 28th at the town moor for murder. And in August of 1754, Dorothy Catenby was hanged on the town moor for the murder of her illegitimate child. And in February of 1758, William Bland, who had been press-ganged into service as a soldier, was hanged on the town moor for desertion. And in August of the same year, Alice Williamson, was hanged for just breaking into a house. In 1764, George Stewart, a pawnbroker, was hanged on the town moor on August the 27th for the murder of a keelman by the name of Robert Lindsay. Now, after his execution, his body was given to surgeons Mr. Smith, Mr. Gibbons, Mr. Tyzack and Mr. Lambert. They then lectured on the dissection of his body, and it was stated that not only medical students but others from the town crowded the room to watch the body of the murderer being taken apart bit by bit. And in September of the same year, James Edgar was hanged at the West Gate for breaking into the home of Edward Bigg of Jesmond. In 1776, Robert Knowles, a postman of Northshields, was hanged on the town moor for stealing a money letter from the Newcastle post office. And on the same day, Andrew Mackenzie, a soldier, was hanged at the West Gate in Newcastle for robbery. And it was said that a man by the name of William Robson, who had watched both executions, died at the scene of the gallows at Westgate. Now perhaps the story was suggesting that the shock of watching two hangings in one day was too much for his body to take. In 1783, William Alexander was hanged on the town moor for forgery, and in 1784, James Chambers and William Collins were both hanged on the town moor for stealing from a man called Jasper Anderson. In August of 1786, Henry Jennings was hanged on the town moor for horse stealing. During the execution, a boy by the name of Peter Donison was caught picking the pockets of a man standing next to the gallows. Sadly, I did not find any details of what happened to Peter after this, but as he was just a child, we have to hope that he was sent to prison for his crime and not transported. And it was actually quite common for pickpockets to operate on the town moor during executions. In 1790, Thomas Watson was hanged at the Westgate for the murder of George Gibson. And during Thomas's trial, it was said that a lady by the name of Jane Stevenson was caught picking pockets in the courtroom. It seems no time was wasted. She was quickly arrested and tried and found guilty and sentenced to 7 years transportation, all within a few minutes of her committing the crime. And I bet she wished that she'd stayed home that day instead. In 1792, William Winter and Jane and Eleanor Clark were hanged at Westgate for the murder of Margaret Crozier at Elsdon. The two women's bodies were taken for dissection, and the body of William Winter was gibbeted at Elsdon, and again this would have been near to the scene of the crime. Now this is another story that I hope to cover in more detail at a later date, and I also hope to visit the gibbet at Elsdon next year. I had planned to go this year, but obviously other things got in the way and I wasn't able to go. And as it's quite an open space, it is much better to go in the summertime when it's less likely to be windy. Otherwise, any videos that were recorded at the scene, you wouldn't be able to hear them for the wind. In 1795, Thomas Nicholson, who was 22 years old, was hanged on the town moor for the murder of Thomas Purvis. In 1805, Thomas Clare was hanged at the Westgate for the murder of William Todd. And in 1816, James O'Neill, who was around 23 years old, was hanged for the robbery of George Angus. James was said to have been hanged on the west side of the road heading towards Kenton between the barracks and Fenham Gate. It's not clear why this location was used, but perhaps it was the area where the crime was committed. In 1817, Charles Smith was hanged on the town moor for the murder of Charles Stewart. And this brings us to the hanging of Jane Jameson for the murder of her mother, which took place in 1829. And this is a story that I have covered fully in another video. And all of the executions after this date, which took place on the town moor, have all been covered in other videos that I have done a while ago. Now, as said earlier, a lot of these stories in this video have very little information, but I do hope that you have still found it interesting to hear even the small amount known about them. And I will continue to keep checking and searching, and if I ever find enough information to cover any of them in more detail, then I obviously will do so. I have to say that I found some of the reasons that people were hanged in the past somewhat odd. Some were for very minor offences, such as stealing spoons or stealing a horse, and it did seem a little extreme that they were hanged for those reasons. And also some of the forms of execution used could only be described as barbaric. Hung, drawn and quartered is perhaps one of the worst. And of course it wasn't just the awful forms of execution used that was strange, but also the fact that people of the area would happily go and watch these take place. It was very much seen as a form of entertainment. As for the alternative, which was transportation, this may have sounded better as the prisoner did not lose their life, but they would be sent miles away from any friends or family, and for the majority of them it would be unlikely that they would ever see them again, as most, as said earlier, would not be able to afford to get back to the UK. Now I have to admit, going back to the people of the area using executions as a form of entertainment, that no amount of boredom or lack of a TV to watch would have made me head off to watch someone being hung, drawn and quartered. And I do have to ask, would any of you listening have ever wanted to go and watch? Or are you all like me, preferring simply to hear the stories many years after they took place? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below on some or all of the stories included in this video, and whether or not you would have wanted to join the crowds on the town moor to watch an execution take place. I do hope that you have found this compilation of executions video interesting. I know, like I said before, and I've said it a couple of times, and I feel like I'm repeating myself, but I didn't actually mean to. But, you know, like I say, some of these do have very little information about them, but I do hope that you have still enjoyed it. And I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.